welcome to the Video Research Workshop, Video Analysis of Congressional Behavior. I'm Andrea Langrish, Managing Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. This workshop is hosted by the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and the Advanced Methods at Purdue in the Behavioral, Health, and Social Sciences. To tell us more about the workshop is Dr. Robert Browning, Professor and Faculty Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and the Executive Director of the C-SPAN Archives. Robert?
Oh, well, thank you. And we're very excited to have this presentation this afternoon. Everybody always says to us, well, what can you do with the video library and what can you do with the video library? And how can you study, say, congressional behavior? And so we're going to answer all three of those questions this afternoon with Bryce Deitrich. And Bryce is a great follower of the C-SPAN archives and started his work as a graduate student at the University of Illinois and now is a professor at the University of Iowa, and he's published in one of our volumes and continues to do work using video and audio to study congressional behavior. So I'll let Andrea give you a formal introduction, but we're very excited to have this presentation this afternoon.
Absolutely. We are actually very excited to have leading the workshop renowned scholar, Dr. Bryce Deitrich. He is an assistant professor of social science informatics in the Department of Political Science at the University of Iowa. His research uses novel quantitative, automated, and machine learning methods to analyze non-traditional data sources such as audio or speech data and video data. These methods are used to understand the causes and consequences of non-verbal political behavior, such as vocal inflections and walking trajectories, especially in relation to descriptive representation and implicit gender racial bias. His work has appeared in Nature, American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Political Analysis, and Political Psychology. This work has also received grant support from major organizations like the NIH and NSF, and has been covered by popular outlets like NPR, BBC, The Economist, The Washington Post, and 538. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois and was recently a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School and Northeastern University. Welcome, Dr. Bryce Deitrich.
Excellent. Thank you all for having me. I am a big fan of the C-SPAN video archive or video library and the C-SPAN archive, so I'm happy to help any way that I can. I'm going to share my screen and kind of give an overview of what I hope to accomplish today. So let me do that. All right. So this is what I hope to get through. We'll see in terms of time about whether or not I'm able to accomplish all of these things. But the first step is just to give a broad overview of what social scientists have done with video as data, and I'll explain what that means. Then I'll specifically talk about motion detection, which is my first publication that deals with video data, specifically related to C-SPAN. Then I'll show some code that walks through how to replicate some of the results in that paper. Then I'll talk about a more advanced method called object tracking that will talk about how to take members of Congress, for example, and track their positions over time during the course of the video. Show some example code that gives a sense of how to do that manually, but also how to do that in an automated fashion. And then hopefully, if we have time, get back to this problem of 3D inference within 3 dimensions, which is something that I'm particularly interested in. And it's not entirely straightforward on how you approach this problem. So in terms of video data in general, I want to try to differentiate it from this literature in political science, which is all dealing with images. So in all of these studies, it's basically some variation of I've collected images from some source, I've coded them for a variety of things that I'm interested in, and then I've either classified those using a machine learning algorithm, or I've used just quantitative analysis to combine those codes together into some sort of regression is typically what has been done. So this is distinctly different from video data because in video data, it's essentially a you have multiple time series working simultaneously over the duration of a video, which is a much harder problem than what you're typically dealing with when you talk about images specifically. So there are some good examples that I would say of social science literature that specifically uses video as data. So this is Eric Busey, I believe, was part of this workshop a little while ago. So he has a paper with some co-authors that automated this coding of televised leader displays, and he has a book on this and some other things that all deal with taking images from presidential debates or whatnot and coding for things like facial expressions, things of that sort. Another good example of this is actually from computer science. So this is a 2016 piece, and there's also a follow-up by Kosuke Aime, where they apply an automated method to political video ads, and they look for things like positivity, negativity, subject matter, so forth and so on. So I describe these studies as video as images because what essentially these studies are is taking a video and dividing it into frames and then applying some sort of methodology to the frames. But there's very little interest in how those frames interact with one another over time. And so that's distinctly different than the things that I will be talking about today, which is thinking more about video as a dynamic medium instead of a static medium, which is typically how previous scholars have approached these problems. So I think the best examples of the type of analysis that I am interested in is actually in sociology. And so in sociology, they have a lot of video work that specifically focuses on social interactions. So this would be like videotapes of people interacting in a meeting, videotapes of people interacting in a hallway, and then trying to infer properties of that social interaction and also properties of the community as a whole. This particular literature is specifically related to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is object tracking, where we want to know the proximity of objects vis-a-vis others, and then how those objects move over space and time. So specifically, the gold standard in terms of object tracking would look like something like this. And so this is from a pretty famous algorithm that can analyze pedestrian movements using something like a traffic camera or something along those lines. And so here you have a really hard problem where it's not just that this person is a pedestrian, but it's that this person is pedestrian A, and then I want to follow pedestrian A during the duration of the video. So in the context of C-SPAN, as we'll find out, what I mostly have been working on is members of Congress interacting after floor votes using C-SPAN footage, which looks very similar to this from some of the camera angles. So my piece that's forthcoming in Nature and Human Behavior uses object tracking to look at essentially racial avoidance on city streets. And so we'll hopefully get to this paper at the end. It's not specifically related to C-SPAN, but it does deal nicely showing how the way people position themselves vis-a-vis one another is politically relevant. And so this paper, it's all about showing how people on New York City sidewalks tend to deviate further from African Americans than Caucasians. And so this idea of proximity to one another, we're not the first ones to say that matters. There's literature in psychology that talks about proximity as a variable of interest, but applying that to politically relevant phenomenon is something that me and others that I work with are particularly interested in. So the current approach that in terms of published work right now is in terms of motion detection. And so I'll talk about this paper in the next set of slides. But essentially, motion detection is a way to determine the dynamics, broadly speaking, within a video from one frame to the next. And so essentially what you're trying to determine is whether or not frame A is distinctly different from frame B in terms of the objects moving in space. So in this strategy, you can't say specifically that object A is moving from point 1 to point 2 within a XY coordinate space. But you can't say generally whether or not there's more motion or activity in a video using this approach. So this is the reason why we're going to talk about this today, is that this is by no means state of the art, but I will show you that if you make smart assumptions from a research design standpoint, you can actually use motion detection to get pretty interesting inferences about things like people moving in space, but also things like nonverbal behavior in terms of like hand gestures and things of that sort. And also the reason why we're going to talk about this today is that this is a very straightforward methodology. It's something that you can execute in a couple lines of code and doesn't require additional training in terms of computer vision algorithms. So another popular method in computer vision is dealing with optical flow. So essentially what optical flow is trying to do is, from a pixel by pixel standpoint, it's trying to determine how much motion there is within each section of a video. So why would you use such a thing? So the main use of this, beyond just using it as an input into some sort of other machine learning algorithm, is that this is a much better way to conceptualize motion within a video, because it's not just the video in general is changing, but it's these specific sections of the video are changing from pixel to pixel. And so a really good example of how this study can be utilized, or how this methodology can be utilized for something that social scientists would be interested in, is this really nice paper that was done in 2016 in the Frontiers in Psychology called Automated Video Analysis of Nonverbal Communication in Medical Settings. So the first thing that they do is they essentially use a random experiment where they have two different versions of interactions between a physician and a patient. In performance A, it's very kind of rote. So they're typing on a paper, on a computer, they're not really engaging at all with the participant. And then in performance B, they're much more engaging. They're trying to be more interactive in terms of their nonverbal behavior. And so the way that they measure this is something that at the end of today, you could easily do this type of study, maybe not necessarily using optical flow, but certainly using motion detection. Because the first thing that they look at is synchronicity and behavior. And so the normalized cross correlation is on the y-axis. And so for our purposes, just know that higher correlations mean that the two individuals' nonverbal behavior is more in sync during the duration of the video. So higher values imply that they're synchronizing more aggressively than in terms of lower evaluations. And so in performance B, when you have a doctor who's trying to engage with the patient, you see this really nice synchronicity across behavior, which is something that within nonverbal communication in psychology is shown as a consistent effect that researchers have been able to isolate, that if I'm animated in this presentation, you're more likely to be engaged and you're more likely to be animated yourself. Similarly, if I'm angry, you're also more likely to be angry, or if I'm happy, you're also more likely to be happy. So the synchronicity amongst behavior is really important, because other studies in psychology have shown that this synchronicity in behavior is often a predecessor to things like persuasion. So if people are in sync, you're more attuned to what's going on, and ultimately it can predict behavior at the back end. And so this cross correlation we're not necessarily going to deal with specifically today. I'll describe this when we deal with manual tracking, but this measure, so in this study, they use something that's called jitter, which is just a high frequency measure of motion. But honestly, for our purposes, we can just think of this as motion. And so on the y-axis, all they're showing is that when there's this rote performance from the doctor in performance A, the subject displays less motion in their side of the video when performance A, when the doctor is being more in terms of rote, versus performance B, when they're much more engaging, which is this idea of the energy of the physician is translating to the patient, is what this article references in terms of the psych literature. And it's also a good way to conceptualize how would video motion or how would video interactions be relevant from a social standpoint. So at this point, I think it's worth pausing and just saying that, a lot of people, might push back and say, well, why would we want to know synchronicity versus all these other variables that we'd be interested in from a nonverbal communication component? And so in the psych literature, there's a lot of studies that have shown that these are much more difficult for people to control. And so they're much more reflective of their underlying predispositions. And so if you're talking about subtle change in movement, it's going to be a much better predictor of maybe their underlying predispositions to that interaction or how they're evaluated over the course of the experiment than something that's more, that might be more easier to measure. I'll put that in quotations because there's definitely measurement problems with self-reports, but it will give you new insights into that behavior and potentially how it relates to politics. So that is the end of my first slide. So I'm now going to transition into motion detection. So at this point, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions in terms of the overview material before I talk about motion detection specifically. All right. Seems like no, which is fine. I just want to make sure that I give people opportunities to interact. So let's talk more specifically about one technique that I've already referenced, which is motion detection. And so this is the paper that I was referring to a few slides ago. So using motion detection to measure social polarization in the US House of Representatives. So it's worth mentioning that this paper would not be possible without the C-SPAN video library, and more importantly, without the help of the great people who work for the C-SPAN archives, because they helped me immensely in terms of collecting the videos for this particular project. And so it really could not be done without those folks. So in this paper, the main question is whether or not members of Congress cross the aisle more or less than they used to. And so the physical act of crossing the aisle is both symbolically important in the sense that Democrats and Republicans are walking across the aisle to shake hands, things of that sort. But it's also indicative of a broader environment where members of Congress from both parties are actually talking to one another. And so with these types of images, which are very common on C-SPAN, the real question is, can we create a measure that can effectively capture, quote unquote, crossing the aisle? And this is not in the figurative sense, this is in the literal sense, the extent to which Democrats and Republicans move from one side of the aisle to the other. So ultimately in this project, I end up relying on motion detection. And the reason why I can rely on motion detection is that the House floor and the Senate floor have a unique feature, which is Democrats tend to sit on one side of the aisle, like physically sit on one side of the aisle, and Republicans physically sit on the other side of the aisle. So if you make this assumption that motion is more likely to occur when members of Congress stand up and walk to the other side of the room than in instances where they stay on their own sides of the aisle, then you can use that in order to do things like predict future party votes, which is ultimately what is done in this paper. So to provide a little bit more detail, so this is a figure that's in the paper that explains like all the steps in this process. And so the first big challenge that we're actually not going to deal with today is a lot of the C-SPAN videos are very long, even when they're trimmed down to things like floor votes. And so the question then becomes, if I don't want the whole video, what I want is this scene, these overhead shots. So how can I take a video and then ultimately subset that video to the scenes that I want? And so in computer vision, this is called scene detection. And so in this paper, I use, I'm going to talk about it here in a second, but I use essentially pairwise comparisons between image hashes in order to detect the scenes that I want. There's a lot better ways, a lot better different types of algorithms that can do this more effectively than what I did in this paper, even though what I did in this paper worked pretty well. But scene detection, there's a whole literature in this, and I certainly hope to write more about this from a political science perspective. So that gets us through like this line here. And so then once you have all the images that you want together, then the next question is, how do we calculate the motion within those videos? And in this paper, I use a technique called frame differencing, which is literally just comparing every frame of video and seeing the degree to which those videos are similar to those frames are similar to one another, with the idea being that if you see greater difference between the frames, you see greater motion. And so this is a standard motion detection technique. And so I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of it as we move along. So the first is, as I alluded to, the subsetting of image hashing, or subsetting of images and doing these pairwise comparisons. So the reason why one would have to do such a thing is because images are really big and images are very difficult to load in and out of memory, especially when you're trying to do 113 billion comparisons between all of these images. That in-out step, that loading, unloading image step, can become really computationally intensive. And so the first way to minimize that problem is to translate an image into what is called a hash, or in my example, it would be a string that is 16 hexadecimal characters long. And so there's a lot of hashing algorithms that are floating around. The one that I use in my work is what is called the perceptual hash. And this slide shows an example of how an image, in this instance, the Doge meme, is translated into ones and zeros. So hashing is actually extremely interesting and is very important to a lot of applications. From your end, the instance where you probably dealt with hashing as much, which now, things like Siri and Alexa deal with this more often, but there used to be Shazam. I mean, Shazam has kind of been rolled into a lot of different other software. And so Shazam, you used to be able to play a song into your phone or play a song into the app, and it would tell you, here's what the song is. So underlying that search is a hashing algorithm, because those songs are not stored as audio files in those databases. They're served as hashes that are essentially summaries of all the relevant information within the audio signal for the purposes of querying an audio database. So the perceptual hash is precisely this. It is this for image data, which allows for easily querying large image data sets, or in my example, comparing a whole bunch of images in order to try to find the ones that are similar to the images that I need. So the way that motion was detected in this project is that we use an approach called frame differencing. And so there's a lot of different ways to calculate frame differencing, or the difference between frames. The one that is most commonly used in the literature is one that is called the structural similarity index. And so the structural similarity index can both be used for motion detection, and a lot of applications it's used to assess video quality by looking at kind of a pristine 4K image and some sort of deteriorated image is another thing that it's used for. Because all the structural similarity index will give you is the difference between image A and image B. So without going into the math on this particular equation, the most important section of this equation is here, the sigma squares at the bottom, which are just, or sorry, here. In the numerator, this is the cross correlation between X and Y. So X and Y are two images. So the cross correlation with the degree to which those images are correlated with one another. And everything else is just meant to standardize that metric. So it ranges between 0 and 1, with 0 being no similarity and 1 being identical images. So, up to this point, I've done a lot of hand waving, and I've said, oh yes, you can use motion detection in order to actually track real world behavior on something like the house floor. But in the paper, I don't get many times to talk about things that are in the appendix. But if you're interested in this, there's a lot of details in the appendix about the technical details about how this project is implemented. But the two things I want to talk about today is two of the validation approaches that are used that I think are fairly interesting. So the first is I took a whole bunch of these videos and I essentially identified instances where members of Congress were crossing the aisle, like either from south to north or north to south. So literally they were physically crossing the aisle, and then instances where they were not doing this. And then what this figure shows you is that the structural similarity score is lower when members of Congress are walking in the well of the House. So when members of Congress cross the well of the House, the structural similarity score between the frames on average is lower, which implies more motion. And this is a consistent finding against all the data that's in the data set, which is from the 105th to 112th Congress. So in that instance, I labeled some videos. I said, this person's crossing the aisle. And then I show that the structural similarity score tends to correlate with that crossing behavior in a very specific sense. The second way that I validated the measure, which I actually think is an interesting way, not just for validating measures, but potentially for thinking about how to quantify variables of interest. So in this instance, I took a series of these videos and I had an undergraduate RA go through and track manually all the pedestrians and all the members of Congress in the video. And then I'll show you an example of that later on in the workshop. But once you have everybody tracked, then you can use the tracking information to create these very abstract representations of the video, which is shown here at the bottom panel. But most importantly, once you have the tracking information, you can actually remove a member of Congress from that video. Because now the member of Congress is not a person, a physical object on a video, it's a dot moving across the screen. And so you can say, I'm going to take this member of Congress out of the video, and then I'm going to calculate these aggregate measures. In my instance, I'm doing structural similarity, but you could do other aggregate measures. And then I'm going to see what happens to this aggregate measure when I remove this member of Congress from the equation. So through that, you can then say, okay, now that I can remove certain members of Congress, let's try to identify members of Congress that I care about for the purposes of my analysis. And again, in this paper, I'm interested in members of Congress who literally walk from one side of the House well to the other. And so when I do that, the prediction would be if I remove the people who are walking from one side of the screen to the other, then the structural similarity scores should decrease, implying greater motion in those videos. And that's essentially what I find in this plot, which just shows the dark gray boxes indicate that members of Congress crossed the aisle, whereas the light gray box indicated that they did not cross the aisle. So when the dots that I remove are members of Congress crossing the aisle, the structural similarity within those videos goes down, which implies more motion. So all of this is meant to emphasize that, and I'll show you the substantive implications here in a second, but all of this is meant to emphasize that what's really fascinating about doing video work now is that a lot of the methodology, there's a lot of work from a methodological standpoint on how to properly analyze videos in computer science, i.e. how to do object tracking. What is less prevalent within computer science is how do we gain inferences from that output? Like how do we actually say things from a statistical standpoint that allows us to test hypotheses that we're interested in. And so what I've been doing in my work and what I'm really interested in is bridging that gap. So not just saying that we should use new methodology to analyze videos, but once we do that, what can we actually do? How can we gain inference about the behaviors that we're interested in? And I think that in the appendix of this paper, there are two kind of ways that, at least in terms of my thought process, about how to do that in terms of these measures. So the substantive conclusion of this paper is that structural similarity is highly correlated with ideological differences over time. So I took the average structural similarity in the 105th to the 112th, and then I took the average ideological divisions in terms of DW nominate scores. I'm not going to go into those for the non-political scientists, but basically it just means Democrats and Republicans are ideologically divided. And the correlation between those two measures over time is 0.79, which if you've dealt with any social science data is really, really high. Like 0.79 is not typically what you would see in a lot of social science variables, which implies that there's something going on in these videos that is consistent with the theory that is in this paper, which is related to more ideological polarization. And then the second finding in this paper is just showing that the structural similarity score that I've been talking about predicts future party votes on the day in which the structural similarity score is calculated. Meaning that if in the morning I see less structural similarity, meaning more motion, then I would expect to see more bipartisanship later in the afternoon. Or as this table is organized, if structural similarity is higher in the morning, meaning less people crossing the aisle, then I should see more party votes later in the afternoon. And that's exactly what this table is showing, which again implies that these video-based measures are perhaps predictive of an environment in which social polarization and eventually polarized voting is more likely. Okay, so this is the end of the second set of slides. So I will pause here and answer any questions. A lot of this has just been me explaining things. What we're going to pivot to now is me showing you a few things in terms of how to do some of the techniques that I've already talked about. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, see if anything pops up, and then we will move on from there.
Bryce, what did you find to be the most challenging aspect of getting the raw data from the C-SPAN video library?
That is a great question. So getting the videos from the C-SPAN video library with the help of some of their staff, like they were very good at getting me kind of like, let's say 80% of the way, i.e. What I was able to get is like, here are all the videos that deal with floor votes. The most challenging part of this whole project was taking that longer video, even if it's like a couple of minutes, and identifying these specific frames that I was interested in. That's a really challenging problem. And in that paper, I use these hash comparisons, which worked pretty well, which required undergraduates to essentially identify a whole bunch of these frames. I put those into a bucket, and then I compared those frames with every other frame in the C-SPAN data that I collected to identify the ones that I wanted. an NSF grant that has just been funded that deals with political ads, we have a much better scene detection algorithm that uses a lot of other things that are important. So for example, like this particular approach didn't use any of the audio streams when trying to identify the scenes, which if you watch C-SPAN, the audio that's associated with those mingle shots is very different than the audio that's associated with the floor speech, for example. So those things should also be useful, but scene detection is really challenging. But I think if I were to do it again, I think I could do it faster than what I did before. Okay, so if there's no additional questions, I will move on. So the first thing I'm going to briefly show is FFmpeg. And so if you're familiar, if you're interested in doing any, I'm just gonna, let me try to think of the best way to show this. Yeah, let me stop sharing this and I'm gonna go to this URL first. All right, so then I will share this just so you can kind of see what the home page looks like. So this is FFmpeg. This program has been in existence for a ridiculously long period of time and really is a Swiss Army knife when it comes to video files and image files. So if you ever need something that converts X into Y or splits things up or anything like that, FFmpeg is easily the most useful tool that is in existence and can work on a lot of different platforms. And there's a big support community related to this. And so what I'm going to show you after I stop sharing you this link is, let me show the example. So let me share this. Sorry, I'm bouncing around a bit here, but all right. So I got this using the clip generator on the C-SPAN video library. And so this is from last fall. And so this is just a simple video of some members of Congress or members of the Senate mingling after a floor vote, kind of similar to what I'm using in this shot. So this is a 20-second video, pretty straightforward. So the first question that we need to deal with this video is, in order to do frame differencing, I need frames. So I can't just have videos, I need the frames themselves. And so FFmpeg is a great source in order to do that. And so let me stop sharing that, and then I'm going to open this up and show you this. So this is just a Mac terminal. So if you're on a Windows machine, there's a different terminal that you would use, but FFmpeg has a lot of support for Windows as well. But this is generally the command that you'd use if you're using a Mac or a Linux operating system. And so the FFmpeg call looks like this. And so what this is doing, the I is the input to the video. So the floorvote.mp4 is what I just showed you. The R1 is how many frames, how often do I want to extract a frame from a video? So there's no hard and set rule to this, but most of the literature you'll see 1 frame per second, unless you're trying to do something really refined. And so that's why it's -R1. So I'm just going to say, give me a frame per second. The last line is just basically caching all of those frames into this folder called vote frames and then giving it a sequential number. So later on, when we talk about manual tracking, you got to have the images have numbers that are in order because you have to sort the images from the beginning to the end. So the earliest image needs to have a 1, the last image needs to have a 10 or whatever the last number is in terms of the labeling. Because even with frame differencing, you don't want to compare image 1 to 20. You want to compare image 1 to 2. So you want to make sure that the file names are sequential. And that's what this code will guarantee. So if you click this, it'll kind of hem and haw for a little bit, and then it'll quickly convert all the files. And so it's as simple as that. And so this reminds me, at the end of all of this, I will share like all of this code so you don't have to type all of this yourself, so you could use it on your own time. But once the video frames are extracted, I will show you what those look like. So now it looks like this. So now it's the same video, but now I have individual images for every second of that video. So once you have that, the next step is the the next step is to actually do the frame differencing. And here I'm using R. I'll walk through some of this. In the paper, I actually used Python, but I didn't want to do too Python heavy in this particular workshop, but you can do all this in Python too, if that's more familiar with you. So the spatial pack in R is what calculates the structural similarity scores. Everything else is very standard, except for this JPEG library allows you to upload a JPEG image into R. So what this is doing is it's getting all the list of frames. So this list file function, if you look down here, my frames, all it did was go to that directory and get the list of all the frames that I just created. And then I'm going to go through frame by frame. I'm going to take the current frame and then compare it to the previous frame in order to do the frame differencing. And so that's why the for loop starts at 2. So it's going to start at the second frame, compare it to the first frame. Go to the third frame, compare it to the second frame. Go to the fourth frame, compare it to the third frame. Go to the fifth frame, compare it to the fourth frame, so forth and so on. So the only thing that might be a little bit tricky, it's not really tricky, but might jump out at you is this line, line 11 and line 14. So what this is doing is converting the image to grayscale. So images, when you load them into R, is stored as RGBs, which are 3 channels, red, blue, and green. And so there's different formulas that people can use in order to convert those to grayscale. There's also specific functions in R and Python that will do this for you, so you don't have to have this actual formula. But I figured I would show this just to emphasize that most video applications, you want to convert to grayscale first because it's easier to deal with a single matrix than it is to deal with 3 matrices, which is what you typically get if you were to use an RGB formatting. So here on line 15 is where the structural similarity scores are actually being calculated. And the rest of it is just compiling it into a data set. And so I'll let that run for a second. And so if I do head, which just gives me the first 5 rows of this, you'll see the structural similarity scores are really high. And that's because most of the stuff in the images are identical. There's only small sorts of things moving around. So the question becomes, what does this mean? 0.999? What does 0.999607 mean? Beyond just like higher equals more similar than lower. So that's why in the paper that I showed you and in subsequent applications, I always standardize the results into plus or minus standard deviations above the mean for the video. So that's what's happening here, is I'm just standardizing it to plus or minus the mean. And so if you look at this, now you can say, okay, 0.999905 is 1.6 standard deviations above the mean. So 1.6 standard deviations above what we would expect based on the average structural similarity score for the entirety of the video. And so this standardization, however it is that you do it, is a prerequisite, because otherwise it makes it difficult to interpret the results. It also makes it difficult to interpret one video to the next, because if you have 2 videos, they're going to have different structural similarity scores, but it could just be because the nature of the video makes it more similar to one another. So some standardization score is necessary. So the last line in line 22 is just copying that output to a spreadsheet. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to show you the spreadsheet and then talk about what we're looking at. So the spreadsheet. All right, sorry. I was like, where did I save the spreadsheet? Okay, so this is what the output looks like once you execute the code. So you got all these standardized structural similarity scores. The rows correspond to the frame number. So this would be the second frame that we've extracted. And again, this is 1 second in, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, so forth and so on. So standardized structural similarity works the same way as structural similarity, meaning that higher values imply less motion. So the bulk of the motion in this video is happening right here through frames 8, 9, and 10 is where the vast majority of the motion is happening. And specifically at frame 10, you see it's like 2 standard deviations higher or below or lower than what we would expect based on the average. So that's where most of the motion is happening. So the next thing I'm going to try to prove to you is that this motion is not random, that it actually correlates with real motion that is happening within the video. And in order to do that, we have to use a program called Fiji, which is a distribution of image J. So let me show you what that looks like. So I will go ahead and put the link into chat, which was a great idea before. So this is what image J looks like. And so let me share my screen again. So image J was a program that was initially funded by an NIH grant to analyze like lab output. So what they developed image J for was to take like Petri dishes and analyze like cells moving over time. But since then, it's a very useful tool for just doing basic object tracking, image differencing, stuff like that. And so I use it a lot for, it's a nice kind of graphical interface program that allows you to do some basic video analysis. And there's a lot of help documentation for this software too. And so if you're looking for something that's point and click, Fiji is a good place to start for a lot of video analysis because it provides a lot of tools that work well for a lot of different types of videos. Okay, so I think this should work. So this is going to be let me try that. So this is a bit odd. So this is what the software looks like once you load it. So it's this little toolbar. And then, let me change the way I'm sharing my screen. I got to share my desktop, or you're not going to be able to see all of this. Desktop, there it is, desktop. All right, so this will be a little surreal because you'll see the zoom first. Okay, so this is image J here. I'm going to kind of reposition it, minimize some of these screens. All right, get rid of that. Get rid of that. So this is the image J prompt. So the first thing I'm going to do is file, image. What's going on here? File. Oh, there it is. File, import, image sequence. So what this will allow me to do is to take all those images that I produce using FFmpeg and import it into the software as a video, basically. So if you do image sequence, you have to browse on your computer to find where those frames are stored. So in my computer, they're all stored here. Hit open, hit OK. Just use all the defaults. And what it's done is it's imported all of those different frames. So if I click on this, and I'm just hitting the right arrow on my keyboard, and I'm cycling through all of those frames. So we're going to use this in a second, a little bit more when we talk about manual tracking. But for now, all I want to try to do is check to see whether or not these results are sensible, make any sense. So the expectation is that we should see people moving around at frame 8, 9, 10, and 11. And so if we look at the video, here's frame 7, here's frame 8, here's frame 9, here's frame 10, here's frame 11, here's frame 12, 13. So it's precisely where we saw the highest structural similarity, or sorry, the lowest structural similarity scores implying more motion, was precisely where we have this group of people talking right here in the middle of the image. And then starting at frame 8, they start going their separate ways. So what's great about motion detection is that it's a very easy measure to calculate. But if you think about from a theoretical standpoint about when you're more likely to observe motion, you can think about different ways that you can use it to test various hypotheses. And the way that I got into working with videos is that when I was at the University of Illinois, we had this thing called the quad cam, where you could watch people 24/7 interacting in this quad area on campus. And I was fascinated by these videos, and I was trying to think, how can I quantify these like social interactions that I'm observing in the video? And so I took a whole bunch of videos off the quad cam, and I found that if I compare these frames over time, that when people stop and talk to each other on the quad, that the video motion tends to go down in that instance because they're not moving. But then when they cross each other, the video motion goes back up. And so that basic insight is very helpful for thinking about kind of aggregate measures. Now, what that insight will not be able to do is tell us who is causing the motion. You know, which one of these senators is the person who's moving the most, or what is the approximate location of these senators? And so that is an entirely different methodology, which is what we're going to turn to now, which is called object tracking. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to see if people have questions before we move on to the next topic.
Bryce, quick question. If you have multiple camera angles in a specific video, does that get taken into consideration when you're doing the tracking?
So,
or how would
yes.
that be?
So there are two things. So the first is that the camera needs to be stagnant. So you have to have the same camera angle, generally speaking, or you have to divide up your analysis where you have analysis for one camera angle versus analysis for others. The interesting thing about multiple camera angles is that algorithmically, it's not very easy, but you can pretty reasonably calculate distance in 3 dimensions using multiple camera angles, which is something that in this particular study, you know, I'm only using a single camera angle in these studies. And so I'm not able to do that. Yes, Robert.
You've shown images of the House and the Senate. Have you done more with the Senate because they're more discrete?
I have not done more with the Senate. The short of it, mostly because the reason. So I'm interested in returning to this, but the reason why I did not do that is that this process of separating the images from these overhead shots from these longer videos was very labor intensive, and so I didn't want to do it twice, and so I stopped at the House is the main reason why. But like I said, we've developed much better ways to segment scenes now, and so I'm interested in going back and potentially working with those videos. Mostly the next one that I want to do in C-SPAN is the closer up images where you can actually see the faces of the members of Congress a little better than what I was working with before. So hopefully with the Senate, I can do something like that. So next thing I'm going to do is object tracking. So I'm going to try my best not to go too deep into the weeds in terms of object tracking, because there's a lot on object tracking, and it's almost all generated because of self-driving cars. And so they've been working on object tracking for a very long time. And so because of that, there's just a lot to work with. So the biggest problem in object tracking that is hard to resolve is the basic problem with object tracking is that you want to say this pedestrian is Sally, not Greg, or something like that. And so that's a hard problem because you're not just trying to talk about general categories, but you're trying to talk about specific individuals. Another real problem with object tracking is when objects cross. And so the algorithms that we'll talk about today are really good if you have a single object that's moving around. Once you have objects starting to cross one another, you'll see it starts breaking down. And so in terms of object tracking problems, single person, single object with a distinct background, very easy to track. So for example, if I had a video of me giving this presentation on Zoom, it'd be very easy to track my head on this presentation, as I will show you. But pedestrians is much harder because you have objects that look very similar to one another. They're more zoomed out and they're crossing, all of which is a much more challenging problem. So with that said, a good place to start for object tracking in video work in general is this website called Pi Image Search. So the granddaddy of them all in terms of object video analysis software is this program called OpenCV, Open Computer Vision. It's been around for decades. It has a lot of infrastructure built into it. And what they do in Pi Image Search is do a nice job of talking about some basic things that you can do on OpenCV. And so when we get to the code example, I'll show you one of these that is very plug and play in terms of basic object tracking using OpenCV. So object detection, I'm not going to go through each of these bullet points just for the sake of time. But with object detection, essentially all you're trying to do is say, this is a car or this is a person. And so the process for that is just to try to generate regions of interest and then say, put these regions of interest into various buckets. Sorry, I'm kind of flipping through to see. Yeah, I don't think, if you want to talk, if you want to go deep on regions of interest and different algorithms to detect regions of interest, please contact me. I'd be happy to give you a more detailed discussion about this process. But to try to keep it more general in terms, I don't want to go too far into the weeds in that discussion. So object tracking in general is the process of taking an initial set of objects that you've detected. That is initial bounding box coordinates. So you'll take a video and you'll say, this is the part of the video that I'm interested in, and you'll draw a little box around that part of the video. Then you create a unique ID for that box. So you say, this is person one. And then you track each of the objects as they move around in the video, maintaining the assignment of the unique IDs. And so what that means is that once you have this box and you say, this is person one, when you look to the next frame and you calculate all your boxes, you want to determine whether or not this box is the same person that is in this box. So that is part of what you're doing in an object detection algorithm. The other thing that's tricky with object detection is that you have to have some sort of rule to say, when my box gets all the way over to this side of the screen and then exits, at what point do I give up on that box? At what point do I say person one is no longer in the video? Which is a whole separate problem when it comes to object tracking. So the best way to get an understanding of what object tracking is a very basic object tracking technique called centroid tracking. And so, so the first thing that you want to do with centroid tracking is to identify some bounding boxes that you're interested in. So this is the example that's easiest to understand. So you say, okay, here are two things that I'm interested in the video, ID one, object two. Then in the second frame, you calculate you detect new objects, and then you say, is this the same object? And so if these are my three objects here, this is one side of the screen, this is the other side of the screen, this is the third side of the screen. And so at time one, you can say this pink dot is this distance from this anchor, this distance from this anchor, this distance from this anchor. And the same thing is true for this pink dot. So you have this idea of where this dot is positioned within space on the video. And then at the next frame, oh, I guess I don't have a image of that. So then at the next frame, this pink dot is going to be maybe towards the more center portion of the screen. And maybe this green dot is going to be towards this other portion of the screen. You do the same sort of calculation where you use these anchors to say, here's where this dot is, respective of the rest of the image. And then the updating procedure is very simple. You say that if ID number one, if this new dot is closer to where ID number one was in the first frame than it is where ID number two was in the first frame, then I'm going to assume that this point that's closest to this original point is the same point, is the same object. And then you repeat that process as the video progresses. And then as you approach the boundary of the video, you say, okay, now in the first frame, I counted two objects. In the 10th frame, I now count one object. I'm going to assume that one of the dots has now left the screen. And so I'm going to deregister that object. And then once I do that, I'm going to identify which of those previous objects were closest to the boundaries of the image. And then I'm going to say, okay, this one was closest to the boundary of the image, so I'm going to assume that's the one that left the screen. Similarly, if you have a new object that comes into the screen and you have a new dot, then the question is, now I have three dots instead of two dots. So now I have to give that new third dot a new ID number, and I'm going to say ID number 3. And hopefully, through that basic idea, you can see how an algorithm approaches this problem, which is you set an initial bounding box coordinates and you say, this is object 1, this is object 2. And then you say at the next frame, is this new object closest to object 1 in the original frame or object 2? If so, I'm going to say that that's object 1. And then as they approach the boundaries of the screen, you then deregister or you jettison the objects at that point. So this is really complicated because you have to have, summaries of objects from a pixel sense. You have to have a model of motion that says, okay, these things are likely to move at this pace. And so I'm going to assume that these objects are very similar to one another in this regard. So for example, an algorithm for tracking vehicles in an autonomous car, that algorithm is going to look different than a pedestrian tracking algorithm because there's a different model of motion that algorithm is using to make these assumptions about how things are moving within the video. So all of that is to say that the reason why there's a million different object tracking algorithms is because there's just a lot of different ways to cut this problem. But the same basic problem exists, which is just, are these objects identical? And how are these objects moving throughout the course of the video? Yeah, so you have a motion module, and you have this. Yeah, okay. Sorry, there's just a lot. These things are a little bit ridiculous now that I see about it. So I teach a whole graduate class on audio and video data. And so we spent a lot of time on object tracking. And so I tried to move a lot of those slides into this. And then on second thought, a lot of this is a little bit more than what we want to try to accomplish in a single session. So now that we have this basic idea of object tracking down, let's talk specifically about the things that we're going to be using in the workshop. So one is called a correlation filter. And so the way that this works is that you're essentially trying to create a filter such that the filtration process produces some sort of desired response. So in our project, what we're going to be doing is using a filter that says, okay, I have this box. Now let's apply a filter that tries to predict what this box is going to look like in the next frame. And then once you do that, typically that's going to have this kind of Gaussian distribution associated with it. And then you can use that Gaussian distribution to make an assumption about the degree to which these two objects are one and the same. So the initial testing that you're providing within these algorithms is, again, an initial bounding box that's provided by you as a user. And then it's tested on new locations and subsequent frames. And these filters are used to try to estimate the degree to which what we're seeing in these subsequent frames are similar to what we began with. And then if one of the new locations that have been identified through these phasers are sufficiently similar, i.e. correlated, these Gaussian distributions are correlated, then we're going to say that the object coordinates should be updated to this new position. And then if none of the new locations are correlated, then this object is deregistered. So in the demonstration, I'll be showing two outputs from this. One is called a kernelized correlation filter, and the other one is called a channel spatial reliability of discriminative correlation filter, which is a lot to say. They're two versions of the same basic model. The other instance that we'll show you is called a multiple instance learning algorithm. So this is a weakly supervised learning where the training instances are arranged in the bags. So basically imagine that the image is divided into a whole bunch of little boxes like this. As we move across the image, all these little boxes. And then when I draw a bounding box around an object, it puts that into one bag, which is the good bag. And then all these other boxes are put into the bad bag. And then once you do that, for the purposes of tracking, as the video progresses, the algorithm asks, should these new boxes that I'm seeing in the second frame be put in the good bag or the bad bag? And it does that by looking at all the different versions of good and bad that it has at its disposal and comparing these new boxes to the good and the bad. And then if it is put in the good bag, then it updates the coordinates of the bounding box again. If not, then it deregisters the object. Okay, so I'm ready to show you examples of this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I think the examples are a little bit more entertaining than talking about the algorithms themselves. So that is a lot of stuff. Does anybody have any specific questions about that before I show you some examples? Okay, so let me show you some examples which are most interesting. All right, so the first thing I'm going to show you is, so this is the Python code. So I'm not going to walk through all of the Python. So this is a modified version of some code that's on PyImageSearch. And so all the basic things that you need to know in this code. One, you have to have Python 3. This code will not run in Python 2. You have to have Python 3. 2, you have to install OpenCV. So OpenCV has synergy with Python 3. So you can use this now using a pip install, if that means anything to you. But basically you can install OpenCV 3 or OpenCV with Python. This module is the trickiest one to install because it has to, OpenCV is its own software, and the module is just a Python code that sits on top of that software. So definitely investigate how to properly install that. It's not super hard, but it's not as easy as installing these other modules if you're familiar with Python at all. But if you need help installing that stuff, just shoot me an email. I'd be happy to let you walk you through it. So what's nice about this code is that once you have it installed, all you have to do is run these command line calls in order to execute these algorithms. And so the object detection trackers that you can use are the 3 that we just talked about, the CSRT, the KCF, and the MIL algorithm. And then I'll show you what those look like in practice. Okay, so I need to share my desktop again because you're not gonna be able to see this otherwise. Shows sharing my desktop. Let me go here. This is the first command line call that I will show. And so I will show this thing working very well, which is, so if you specify in this code, if you specify a path to a video, it'll try to analyze that video. Let me blow this up a little bit more. So if you specify a path to a video, it'll try to analyze the video. If you do not specify a path to the video, it will analyze your webcam. And so I'm going to first see if this works. I don't know if this will work with Zoom going, but we'll see. Oh, did I move it around? Sorry about that. Yep, I added this since the last time I ran this. I need to put an 8 in front of this. 8. All right. So we'll see if this actually works. Oh, I think it did work. Okay, so you should see a little version of me here. Hopefully that's correct. So the way this works is that you have to hit S to select the bounding box. So I'm hitting S and I'm creating this little bounding box around my head. And then once you release S, you have to enter. And then once you do that, it'll start tracking your head. So forth and so on. So the reason why this works is twofold. So one, my head is a very distinct object relative to everything else in my background. And B, the human face is also something that there's a lot of work in computer vision on. So OpenCV has really figured out how to do this kind of human face type of tracking. So we're going to exit this, you have to hit the C button. C button, C. Maybe it's the Q. I don't know why it's, let me quit. It's like kind of locked into this. And this has to be, this was working when I was doing it without Zoom on. Let me see. Let me stop and share my screen for a second, see if I can get out of this. All right, got it out. Okay, so if I open back up this Python code, let me show you, let me share my screen. So the part that I will leave to you, and it's not a particularly hard problem, but it will require some work in Python, is that this line 120 is where this image tracker is declaring this bounding box that is called initBB. And so initBB is originally just an empty cell, but this initBB is ultimately what's getting updated in terms of the bounding box coordinates. And so the reason why I say that is because what I'm going to show you is how to do stuff like that, where it's like, oh, you're showing a video and I'm tracking something in the video. But if you want to save the output, you have to be able to translate, take that initDB output and then save it into another object. And so if you need help with that, just let me know. It's not super difficult, but it would require modifying this code a little bit to make it so I'm not just showing this bounding box on the screen, but I'm actually saving the output. Okay, so let's show an example where we use the same program, but this time we're tracking members of Congress. So let me update this to 8. So this is the same call. Let me share my screen and show desktop again. So this is the same call as before, but instead of using my camera, I'm using the floor video that I showed you earlier. Oh, I did it again. I literally, this time I put an 8 in front of Purdue Workshop, which is not correct. It is up here. So this needs to be an 8. All right. So now we see this floor vote video. So one thing that's tricky about this particular call is that they declare the video really quick, but I think it starts cycling back here in a second. So I have to hit S really fast to pause this video. So then I can select this bounding box like so. And then I hit enter, and then it's tracking this member of Congress. Now watch what happens when she crosses further down on the screen. Does an okay job, but then it loses the member of Congress towards the end there. So not bad. It certainly helps when you zoom in the video or increase the size of the frames. So see, yes, I did it. All right. So if I do the same call, but this time I leave it small like this, and then I hold down S and I go like that, and then I hit enter, you'll see that it has a harder time. And so one thing that you would probably want to do with these types of videos is maybe increase the size of the frames potentially. So it doesn't do too bad. So once it gets to the end, it'll stop it again. So regardless of how you set it up, in order to use these algorithms, you have to initially provide bounding boxes. So the next video I'm going to show you to kind of end this is this video of Dick Durbin speaking. So this is the video. So this one's actually a lot easier to work with because it's a much simpler scene to analyze. And so if I do the Dick Durbin video, like so, let me get that call. Here's the Durbin video. So let me go like that. And I gotta change this line again because it's 8. OpenCV. Like so. I'm telling you, it's like I'm one step forward, 2 steps back to this. All right, so this is the video. So I'm gonna hit S, hold down, get his head, and then hit enter. And this one it does really well. So boop, 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 so forth and so on. And so this is like an out of the box object tracking algorithm. But you know, if you have scenes that look like this, where it's kind of like the object that you're interested in, and there's a very clear background, like these things are going to work very well for that type of application. The more complicated the scene, the smaller the objects that you're tracking, the harder it is going to be to use those kind of out of the box methods. So the last thing I'm going to show is how to create a gold standard, and then we will call it a day, I believe. So I'm going to share my screen again. So the gold standard in object tracking is people. And so some applications, you don't actually need to do an automated method because the video that you're analyzing can just be done manually, the tracking that you're interested in. And so I'm back in this image or this Fiji distribution of image.j that I showed you earlier. I'm going to do file, import image sequence. I'm going to browse. Oh, wait, that is exactly what I want to do. Sorry. I'm confusing my computer here. All right, here we go. So that's the frames of the vote video, hitting OK. And so in ImageJ, there's a plugin called manual tracking. So if you go to tracking, manual tracking. And so what manual tracking will do is that you get to add a track like so. And then you select somebody that you want to track. So we're going to select this member of Congress. And then every time I click on the video, it's going to advance a frame. And so if I click here, it'll go from frame 1 to frame 2. And then it'll give me the coordinates and pixels of that individual. And so if I'm clicking on this person's head, boom, 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 boom. And then she's off the screen, and then I'm going to end the track. And now I can overlay the dots like this. I can overlay the text, I believe. Yeah, show text. Get out of this. So overlay dots, overlay text. And you see that little blue number that's kind of right on their head. That's the tracking that I gave it. And now I can go and follow the tracking dot over the course of the video. And then what's great about this too is that once you get to this point where you have tracking data, you just do control, right click on your mouse, and you can save the data to your desktop or wherever. And then if I'll show you the example that I did before, I think it's these. And so, sorry, that is not, it is, oh, I guess I'll just show you what I just downloaded. And then it looks something like this, where it gives you the XY coordinates, which is mostly what you're interested in for the dot that you labeled. The distance, velocity, pixel value, those, I'm not going to get into those. Those are all things that you can work with in ImageJ. The slice number is the frame number. So frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so forth and so on. And then the XY coordinates. And then once you have the XY coordinates, then it's easy to calculate things like the degree to which the object moves in space. And so the way that I did it is I am loading this data. Sorry, these are, let me do. That, all right. So head dat. So I loaded that data set. I kind of made the file names a little easier to work with. And then I ordered the slice numbers. So it goes from frame 1 to frame, I don't know what the last one was, frame 13. And so one thing that's important about the frames, the slices, is that you don't have frame numbers for the instances where your object did not appear. So this is frame 1 to 13 in terms of this object's path. But if the senator, let's say the senator that we're interested in appears in frame 5 of the video, then it's going to appear as a 5 as the slice number if you theoretically if you load the whole video. So definitely pay attention to those and make sure that you know exactly what you're looking at, because the slices are going to be different in the frames. So all what's happening here is I'm just showing you the percent to which pixel X and pixel Y change from one frame to the next, with the idea being that I'm interested in motion or movement. So I'm interested in how the degree to which these things change over the duration of the video. And so with that in mind, if you look at this file, which was kind of the output of that process, not that file, sorry, this file, which is the output of that process, the greatest change in terms of one frame to the next is at the very last frame. And that's because if you look at Fiji, in this very last frame, sorry, let me just do this one. So towards the end of this members of Congress path, she jumps like a big amount from one spot to the other. So this is a nice segue into the concluding topic, which I'm just going to go back to these videos data slides. And I'm not going to go into this because I don't think we necessarily have as much time. But let me get this up. But all of this is to Sorry, a lot of transitions here. Here we go. All right. So what we started the discussion with is the very last thing that we've not done is this 3D inference. And so that jumping of the member of Congress is an exact reason why 3D inference is a challenge. And that's because on the video, it looks like she did this like superhero move. It jumped from like one side of the room to the other. But the reason why it looks like a superhero move is that pixel distance means different things depending on the perspective of the camera or where the object is vis-a-vis the camera. And so you have to make, there's a lot of different ways to approach that. And the paper that is forthcoming in Nature attempts to do this using a randomized experiment. And so I'll kind of quickly show you this just to give you a flavor of it. And so in this paper, so the way that we get around this problem in this particular paper is that we set up this experiment where we put Confederates standing on these New York City sidewalks. And what we're interested in is how far is pedestrian 12 in this example from these two people standing here. But the problem is that all we have is pixel distance. So if I were to take the pixel distance from 12 to where this guy's standing, it would actually look like he's closer in this instance than if the dot was over here towards where that green arrow is posting. But in actual physical space, that is not the case. They're actually further up on the sidewalk here, but because of the camera angle, it looks closer. So in this paper, the way that we got around this was we make this argument that if you put your treatment object across from something that is unrelated to treatment, so in this instance, all of our treatments is that they're standing across from a wall. So we're essentially creating this funnel. And the idea is that instead of taking the direct measure of distance between pedestrian 12 and these people standing on the sidewalk, we're going to take the difference in distance between pedestrian 12 and the people standing on the sidewalk and this baseline measure. The argument being that the error that is associated with the camera's perspective is going to be the same for the baseline object because it's on the same visual plane as our Confederates. So then if you take the difference between those two measures, you can back out the effective treatment, is the argument. So trying to validate this, the main way that I have worked with validating these types of measures is through agent-based modeling. And so for this paper, I created a 3D rendering of the experiment using this animation software called Blender. And so all this animation does is have pedestrians walking down these simulated sidewalks. And then what's nice about it, once you have a 3D model, is that you can rotate the camera to a different perspective. And so what we're interested in is this bird's eye view versus the original camera angle. The bird's eye view, you don't have the same 3D, 2D problem because you basically translated the experiment into a two-dimensional representation. And so by comparing those distances, we can show that those measures are highly correlated. And then also show that when we do our treatment estimates, the same results emerge from those measures. And so all of this is to say that in terms of inference on these measures, I do think agent-based modeling is helpful. And even in the motion detection paper that I talked about earlier, there's a section where I use an agent-based model to demonstrate the properties of the measure by simply creating a very simple model in R where these Ds and Rs try to find each other on the screen. And I record these frames over time. And then once you have control over the Ds and Rs moving across the screen, you could then say, what is the probability, or what is my measure that I'm interested in, i.e. structural similarity? What does it look like when the Ds and Rs cluster together like this, or when there's more mixing across the Ds and Rs, for example? So inference in this environment is really hard. And so the only thing I would say is standardize your measures as best as you can and think clearly about the design of your measure before you go into trying to analyze it. Think about, if I'm using structural similarity, if I'm using object tracking, what are instances where I could get funky examples with this measure? And then try to think of ways to sidestep those before you actually get to the analysis itself. So with that said, I'd be happy to answer any last minute questions. And I can go into any additional details that people may want me to do.
Can you bring up the last slide of the vote? Well, any of the vote slides in the Senate?
Are you talking about in the Senate?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. 1 second.
Because there's a gaggle going on the top of the screen. And
I see what you're saying.
And I want you to tell me whether there's anything that can be done with that, which is a popular thing, whether it's people gathered around the majority leader or gathered around the former vice president or present vice president, former Senator Harris, whatever. I guess you would be able to tell if new people entered or left the gaggle, I suppose.
So I think that you're referring to like this type of image.
Yeah, the group, yes, over to the right.
Yeah.
The top right. Where
yes.
Up here. Where those,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So
in fact, there are probably, if you count, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 conversations going on the floor, and then probably 1 or 2 off screen. So what could be done with that?
So there are 2 things that immediately come to mind. So the first is that just saying like how many people are involved in these types of conversations, simply just counting the number of people, like that's the easiest problem for sure. So if you wanted to say like, is Senator X involved in this conversation? Now looking at this image, you can already, if you know the basic idea about how the computer is going to be looking at this image, you can predict the sum of the senators that would be the easiest to track or the easiest to identify. So for example, if I had a video where I had this woman in the turquoise coat early on, and I could say that this senator is this person, because her coat is very different than everything else in the image, she'd be extremely easy to identify during the duration of the video. Same thing is true for this gentleman on the left in the brown coat. Same thing, like he has a different look. And so he would be the easiest one to track and to identify during the duration of the screen. People who are in these black suits that are wearing kind of similar things, those would be the more challenging to track. But as we showed, it's all relative. So the way the algorithm would view like this guy in the front in the suit with the grayish hair, the way the algorithm is viewing that is that just as long as that suit does not come close to any other black suit, it's just going to assume that any suit that's like in the front is this person, which, you know, oftentimes it will be pretty accurate, especially in terms of these smaller gatherings. And so, yeah, I mean, there's, in terms of just spatial proximity amongst members of Congress, that's much easier to do. And then also the problem with our traffic camera paper in terms of translating pixel distance into actual distance is that we didn't have access to the actual cameras, and we also didn't have the best measurements of the sidewalks themselves. But the way that it works in terms of videos is that you essentially can create object maps that say this pixel representation means this in terms of distance. And the more accurate you get for those object maps, the better it is in terms of translating pixel to actual distance. And so the problem with ours is that we thought we could get away with just like 2 measurements of the physical distance of the sidewalk. And then we realized that we just really undermeasured the space, that we should have taken several measurements so we know that each visual plane, what is the actual distance in pixels. So yeah, I think that the second time around, we could get a lot better in that regard.
So you were talking about the color of the suit, and you'd recommended earlier to go to black and white versus RGB. Would that go into black and white limit the video processing at all?
Yes. I mean, so it would be, I'm trying to double check to see. Yeah, okay. No. Sorry, I'm double checking to see if the example that I was using did any conversions, and it does not. So yeah, so with object tracking, you know, more data, the better. And so you could certainly convert it to black and white, which would make it process faster. But the ones that I was showing you, it uses the full color spectrum. Because in that instance, more information, the better. And what's nice about the C-SPAN video library is that you actually the videos are is pretty high resolution. And so the higher the resolution of the videos, the better off that you can use in terms of automated tracking. For the New York City traffic camera feeds, the video quality was much, much, much less. And then there was also a time delay from like, that would be approximately 2 seconds, but sometimes it would vary. And so it's hard for a computer that doesn't have like a consistent interval to object tracking is harder. Automated object tracking is harder in that instance. And so in that context, we use manual tracking. All right, let me real quick. I'm just going to put this Dropbox link, even though you're welcome to email me and get the material as well. But let me copy this and then. Oh, wait.
Well, thank you everybody for staying with us. It's been a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. I've always been fascinated by the interactions of the senators because they're more distinct. I think, although Bryce did some path-breaking work on the pixelization and the members crossing the aisle in the House. The Senate, there's famous votes where somebody stands in the middle and they all are bouncing around them, or that person's bouncing around other people. And so that I'm fascinated by the tools that you have here. So very good. Any final questions?
I will say in conclusion that, yes, again, thanks for having me out. And then also, if you're interested in working more in this field, certainly let me know, because there's, like, we had our first like computer vision working group meeting a little while ago, because honestly, like the people who are really, the folks that are doing a lot of this stuff, at least in terms of pedestrian tracking, et cetera, a lot of those people are in sociology. And so there's a couple of people who are kind of newish faculty that are doing a lot of interesting stuff in sociology with computer vision. And so if you're interested in getting involved in that, just let me know.
Okay, that's very good. That's very good. I hadn't thought of sociology. So that's good.
Yeah, they're doing, the stuff that they're doing is like a lot of people are doing stuff with like those Kinect cameras from like like filming people doing various things using the Kinect cameras. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on.
All right.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. And
very good. Very
have
good.
a good one.
Yep.
All right, Dr. Deitrich, thank you very much for joining us today. And everyone, just a reminder that we do have some upcoming workshops. I'm going to share my screen with you. Just a moment here. Again, I'm putting Dr. Deitrich's information up here, but I am going to share with you and remind you that we do have Dr. Christopher Lucas joining us on March 25th. He is an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and he's going to be talking about the audio analysis. And now I'm starting to think about how we can connect like the audio analysis along with that visual analysis you just did, Bryce. So this is a fantastic day. I hope everybody's feeling just as inspired. So thank you all for joining us today, and you guys have a fantastic week.